This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And today I want to say something about Monticello, and I want to say something about taxes. When you're dealing with a significant amount of real estate, you need to watch what's going on in the background. So I often read the legals in the local newspapers to see what's going on in the background. That's the only place where you can get that sort of information. So I was reading the legals, and there was a site at White Heath that was almost on the Y, which the Y, to explain, the Railroad Museum has 7 miles of railroad and a Y at each end. The Y is a triangle. It allows you to turn a train around or let it go off in a different direction. So if you had a train at White Heath, you could either go to Monticello, or you could go to Clinton, or you could go to Champaign. Now, so that happens to be a site where you can organize trains and send them in different directions. So if you want to send a car of honey to Decatur, you could shunt it around and send it in the next direction. So it's kind of a historic site. It had an elevator and a fertilizer organization. And so the acquisition of this piece of land might be helpful. So I spent quite a little bit of time this week researching this site because it's important to us. You have to know that people pay taxes at this time of the year. And when they're finished paying their taxes, there are the tax people who haven't paid their taxes. And there's a group of buyers who it's their career. They buy up titles that don't pay their taxes. And usually they have to pay, go to an auction. They not only pay their taxes, but they auction for the price of the site. So there's a special day, and all the tax buyers appear, and they're usually very well read, and they know just what they're doing, and mostly they're looking for lucrative sites that could sell for apartments or what have you. And I happen to be fairly experienced in this because when we bought Heartland Pathways in the Monticello area, we didn't have a lot of money, and we got to the point of not being able to pay our taxes. So I rolled along to the tax sale, and I got some various information. And one of the pieces of information is that you have a long, skinny piece of land that is probably not going to be interesting to tax buyers. So that was not too bad. There's also the alternative that a tax buyer will buy your land in the hope that he can wait a little while you, the owner, find the money and pay him some extra for having held the site. And so there's a legal paraphernalia there that lets you work with a tax buyer. Going back to the site at Whiteheath, you have to know that the people who were buying the site from a bank where they had a mortgage had probably not met their commitment, and the bank had foreclosed. And so the next thing you have to find out that there are 3 such sites, and only one of them is at Whiteheath, and we're interested in. So can we go to the bank? Probably not, but we're interested in who might be concerned. You're hoping that the public domain, which is Heartland Pathways, has a good reason for existing. We have 33 miles in that general region. About 23 miles goes to Clinton, and we have land on every end of the Railroad Museum. So part of that is already in a rail trail over the Sangamon River. And so the Railroad Museum has become a national level railroad museum. It has gone from the back portions of publicity in Monticello, including a few rotten tomatoes, and has become the front page attraction for Monticello. It's not the only part of Monticello. Monticello city buildings themselves are interesting. They're near to Allerton Park and other natural areas. There's a Cerigotto moraine, which gives the terrain some rolling hills that you don't have in flatland Illinois. There's a Sangamon River that runs adjacent. There's populations of interested people, including young people, at the Champaign-Urbana and Decatur and Danville and other towns around. It's a tourist attraction, and so you not only can come to the Railroad Museum, but you can go to Allerton Park, and if you want, you can get information about Monticello and information about Allerton Park from the web. And interestingly, you get the history of Allerton Park, and you get a relationship to train activities. So then, who do we talk to about this? The date for the sale is the 13th of the month. That's very quick. When you buy a line, you probably have a prospectus for what you want to buy. That's to convince supporters of what they might be able to contribute to. There's also some significant concern if you just buy territory and don't develop it, it can be subject to vandalism and other things. On the other hand, if you buy a set of apartment buildings that are legitimate, then you have an investment and you can always sell it later. So you probably have in your file some details as to what might be the potential of this site. And this, I'm just giving you an example of Whiteheath, but this is so for other places that you might be approached about it. I have in the same day received a note from Clinton to say that there's a sale of land near to your railroad line. You might be interested. And you have to be aware of these things and check them out. If you do that, you have to be a leader. And the state has just got on its legs again for natural areas and transportation, and they're appointing 2 people to the NRCS, which is the Natural Resources and Conservation Service, and they've just appointed 2 PhDs, one a senior administrator to control the things that the NRCS does, like environment and soils and plants and chemicals, and then there's a younger woman who is knowledgeable in soils and wants to work with farmers, and we have things like dicamba that need to be checked out, and how do we work with these chemicals? We have extra nitrogen that gets into the water, and sometimes that's a problem. So it's interesting to see that this 2 people appointed locally, and the Prairie State Conservation Coalition has just lined up with another university to have 3 call-ins. They're in September and October, and these will be 1.5-hour sessions, and they deal with leadership. And there's 3 segments. The first is to get you lined up so that you know your own potentials, so that you're not going to lose out on this. Then there's what you do, and then there's how you work with the system. And I would encourage you to think about that, because what we're lacking in the environmental era is leaders that are committed full-time or part-time to trying to sort these things out and trying to bring people together. The internet has allowed us to join up with each other in a far different way than you would do 50 years ago, where you would have a little communication, but several people would get together and do something significant. Now, a lot more people are involved, and they also expect to see what you're talking about. In the past, people would perhaps know what they were talking about, but they wouldn't be quite so publicly available to see what you're talking about. Just even a video of the train running on a public day would be a significant thing that you wouldn't have had a few years ago. Now back to White Heath. What advantages do we have sitting around there? We have a recently formed 5-year-old Champaign, Havana, and Western Railroad, and it's attempting to re-rail 4 miles of Heartland Pathways corridor, so they have an easement to do that. And then there's a 7-mile tract of railroad that's intact, and so the CH&W Historic Railroad is begging the Surface Transportation Board, which is more or less the federal surface transportation organization, and it controls the closing or maintaining of railroads. So we're talking to Canadian National, and we're talking to the elevators that for a while have found it significant to put their grain on the road, because the price of the elevator rental was too high, the elevator line. And that's probably purposeful, because some of these small communities about 5 miles apart have wooden elevators and not very efficient. They have small sidings, so you can't load 100 cars, you have to load 15 cars. And so there's a little battle between the elevators and the railroaders and the Federal Surface Transportation Board if you're going to work with a line. You may also have to put in a weighbridge somewhere so that you weigh the grain. So we're trying to convince the elevators concerned. Top Flight is one, Prairie is another, and we also have to think about what we do when we get into Champaign. So that's one thing. We also from this site at White Heath, we can also go down to Shady Rest. It's about a mile, and we'd like to take railroad down to Shady Rest, where we would take people in a sort of fun experience of going to a Chautauqua. I mean, might even simulate a Chautauqua, which in day was about 15 miles from Champaign-Urbana and Decatur, and about as far as a horse could take a buggy, so that you could get together as people and enjoy a bottomland forest with some upland and right on the banks of the Sangamon River. So here's an asset. It's called an add-on asset. It may not be an add-on asset for people who are wanting to buy it for apartments or buildings or what have you, but it's certainly an add-on for the public domain, which is Heartland Pathways or the Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad. So there are two things there. There's also part of the Railroad Museum. And if the Railroad Museum is a functional body, it's not only a historic museum, but it's also rents out its lines. It has two lines. First line that they took in the Monticello area was an interurban line that had closed out, and so they could run on that adjacent to a main line. And later, the main line closed, so they at that time bought 7 miles of the main line. So now they have two railroad beds that they can store ADM rail cars. They may be with grain or with whatever base, or they may be empty. And they provide some demurrage for the Railroad Museum, which is helpful, which has helped the museum to buy some extra land so that they won't be encased by development. So you have to think about these things, and most of us are amateur enough that we don't know all the rules of the game. So you need lawyers that can help you interpret this. So one of the advantages of the storage is that those two railroad beds, the middle part of them, can be stored with railroad cars. So then we have to think, how do we go down to Shady Rest, or how do we go into Champaign-Urbana? Okay, it may be that we can take an engine up to White Heath and develop the history there and have a few rail cars, and you can still operate from White Heath at the same time as the storage is maintained, and the other end can be used by the Railroad Museum for public use of the facility, which is kind of fun. And the volunteers there are often railroad oriented. The Scott family and other families have over the years had their finger in the Monticello Railroad Museum pie. We need people like that. And long before that, the Railroad Museum was on North Neal Street, Champaign, near the post office before they expanded. So we're looking at resources. We're looking at that Cerro Gordo moraine. and interesting, the Cerro Gordo moraine. In the same public documents that I was reading, there were details for an orchard that was selling peaches on the Cerro Gordo moraine. Now, if you are coming from Champaign and you take the Monticello Road, you'll suddenly, before you get to Monticello, you'll be climbing a little hill. That's a moraine, and it happens to be where glaciation dropped a lot of glacial till and material, and so there's a kame nearby, and it's often prickled with test wells to see how much gravel is underneath. That gravel is called glacial till. It's fairly small by the time it reaches us. The big blocks drop out in, like the house-sized blocks drop out in Canada. And so this is coming from the Laurentian Shield. And gravel interests and sand interests are interested in this site. Not only the kame, but also the moraine. But that gravel material warms up sooner in the spring, and most of our peaches are coming from southern Illinois because it's a slightly warmer climate. But we can grow peaches on that moraine. So that's another asset we're talking about. But if you go over the crest of the moraine, you will find there are erosion controls. These are contoured corridors where the water that runs off. If you have a rainfall of 5 inches, it can be collected in these contoured areas. They're like a little mound with a small collection device behind, and that helps to stop fantastic erosion. And it happens to be a unique situation where somebody decided to do this, and the national level conservation people decided that this was a good idea. Then there was a little battle between who decided in the first place and who might be benefiting from the invention. So you have this history on the other side. And the water that goes into Alligator Creek that runs through Monticello is less violent because of this. And we're looking for communities that have been there for a long time, and you have to know that there are families that have a commitment to Monticello. They have good schools and good churches and original square, and so knowing each other is important. Just this week, there has been some question about whether Monticello is a sunshine town, which meant that Monticello is a relatively black town, a white town, with occasional black involvement. And so as we're speaking of viruses, and we're talking about the respect that's paid to a black community people, and so you having to think about more than just the pros, but you're looking at the cons, and how do we do this? How do we have an airport? There's been a huge argument about having an airport at Monticello, and there are actually people in Monticello who are putting in pollinator plots, but they're also looking at prairie. And that's new because most of us came to this country and bought land at a low price, and it was rich, rich land, and it's made people wealthy. And there were adjacent to that, there was a Pepsin factory. And this is a sort of thing that would happen in similar situations in other communities where Dr. Caldwell, who probably birthed most of the population at that time, knew that pepsin could be squeezed out of Seneca leaves, and he did that with a little apple cider press in the basement of a storefront on the county square. So then it went to entrepreneurship with a Piatt family building not too far away, which was developed. And eventually it had an E where the Piatt County house was in the middle of the E, and there was a 5-story building on one side and a 3-story building on the other. And that is part of economic history, is where somebody is an entrepreneur, invents a machine or a drink or a elixir, in this case, something that would quiet laxatives or constipation, and was very popular around the world. So there was a spur line in there. And this was also part of the community. Eventually there was 250 or 300 people that worked there, and they came in from all over. And it was eventually demolished as a factory. It was owned locally, then it went to entrepreneurship, then it went to a Glenbrook group, and then it went to Bayer, a famous German company. And then the 8 products that were being produced there they were doing spot or individual addition. So you would take your product to the 5th floor and you would drop it, and then you would add some alcohol, and you would add some sugar, and you would add something else. And eventually on the 1st floor, you would have loading and packaging and movement around the world. So that is classic history, and it's a history of economics. State Street is loaded with millionaire people's houses, where the horse stable is big enough for a house in modern days. So you have resources in Monticello that relate to this tiny little piece of land, but the opportunity is there. And so you have to gently trying to find out what might be valuable and what might be awkward to do. Does Monticello have a commercial development side? Yes. Kelly McFarlane does that. Is there a cityscape organization? Yes, there is. Is there an organization that works with the Sanger land conservation group? Yes. Is there a nearby Allerton Park, which is sort of itching to make their house big enough to handle venues of some size and weddings of some size? So you need to exercise your mind about what is this resource. The money came from the Civil War, provision of food by Sam Allerton, but there was a Armenia Center where he had an elevator, and we've lost that. So we have to be concerned about losing our adjunct spaces. But if you go to the Allerton web, you will get a Derek Peterson will give you a walk around the gardens and say something about Robert Alton, who was the son, and then Robert Alton adopted a landscaper, and he's involved too. So they had gardens where they had vegetables, but they also had flowers. These days, there's more concentration on flowers than vegetables, but there's a real attempt to recreate the statuary that Robert and John, I think I've got the name wrong, but they were all involved. They have a sunken garden, and there are farmlands that support this sort of organization. And the farmlands also have an interest in providing extra habitat. So we have good habitat. We have trails that are sculptural trails, but also trails that are a natural history. And in one case at Armenia, the university, which now owns the Allerton Park, because John Allerton assigned it to the university, they've given 65 feet by a mile of farmland for increased prairie in order to attract rattlesnakes that are naturally in the area. One rattlesnake was found that was run over, and we haven't really found replacement rattlesnakes in our natural area that's on the railroad bed. The question is, could the railroad bed be a trail? Certainly it could be, but knowing the shortage of any remaining prairie, remnant prairie, it's not the world's greatest by any means, but it's what we have locally. And I've been watching the development of other trails, and often by the time the state gets into the act and you get EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and EDA, and the disabled people love these trails to be wide, but if you're not very careful, you lose the element of what was nature there, and who did this. Early ecologists and TNC, the Nature Conservancy people, have their originals in this area. So then all of this is done somewhat by the seat of the pants, folks. You don't have a big organization, but you try. And one of our attempts was to work within the university framework for best part of 10 years, and then hold a prairie conference, unique locally at Mohammed. And then after that, we created a Grand Prairie Friends. And we didn't want to breathe down the Grand Prairie Friends next. What we wanted to do was to have an advocate for prairie preservation. When the state has managed to preserve something like 0.01% of the prairie that was here, that's almost nothing, and it's in little pieces. So we look for an organization, and it was named the Grand Prairie Friends, and it's done exceptionally well. It's gathered up prairie, and it's gathered up prairie forest, and they now have 1,000 acres, and they're going for more, and they have personnel that are state level people who can get things done, and as they call for volunteers, they can get 100 volunteers, and you have to be organized to do that. We, as a rough and tough organization looking at bits and pieces and how they might be put together and how we can exercise our imagination, are very pleased to be able to hand over to that sort of situation, to the forest preserves, to the Vermilion County Conservation District, and to the CCDC, the Champaign County Design and Conservation Foundation. And there has to be a lot of talking. Over and over, I go to meetings that are natural history meetings, and the plebiscite is, please talk to each other. It may take you 15 years to change the mind of someone who has an adjacent hog farm that wants to cross what you want as a trail, but the mind may change. It's a little bit like the Missouri Katy Trail, where some person bought the whole trail. So talking to each other is tremendously important. And you also have to look at where the funding comes from. Often the funding comes from the 1% which is being very generous and helping. We have 3 major agencies that provide funding for these sorts of situations. But you also need to plebiscite the local yokels. You need a $5 from here and a $5 from there, and you need to have a plan. And the plan, you need to have a leadership there too. Your CEO probably isn't a planner, but a creative person that then can pull in a grant for a planner to create what is called a strategic action plan. That plan may be 200 pages long, rough and tough, not defined yet, 30 pages long for 15 or 20 people who might be involved, 2 pages long for the general public, and there are interactions. So if you're going to work with the elevator, you need to know. If you're going to work with the auctioneer who might convince the buyers to hold off a little bit by just being a little aware of what this plot of land means to this place, then you can do that. It's a little bit like that kid with a bicycle that wants to bid for the bicycle and the other bids don't. They hold back because they think this is part of his education or her education. And so rather wonderful. There are some of the problems we have. Our landscaping is often done by colored people, but if you go to natural history meetings, there are often very few colored people on the board or working at an administrative level. So how do we improve that situation? That we have to think about. Women have been very successful. When we were having large families in the Victorian era, women were at home having children, but at the same time, they would go stand on the courthouse lawn or talk to the mayor, and they saved a lot of natural areas that we wouldn't have otherwise to our availability. And the number of those natural areas is going down, but it's also going up because people realizing that half their, or at least a third of their food is dependent on bees and other insects that pollinate. So if we just have corn and soybeans, that's not a very good dietary thing. Soybeans can probably pollinate itself, but and the corn can be wind pollinated. But all the other vegetables that we eat and the cows that eat them and we eat the cows, then we're dependent on those strange insects. And birds and mammals, and so we are waking up to looking at these things more generally. So back to that site at White Heath. We're thinking about it, and nothing may happen because we may not have money, but it's good for looking at. And I would suggest that you take an interest in this, and sometimes we might be into a Kickstarter or some other program that might allow you to put in $5 here and $5 there, and it's not a great loss. It doesn't go into the actual purpose. It can go to the regular organization is doing things which are popular enough that they're there. So it's excitement. It's finding the wee folk, the little folk. I was outside the store looking at T-shirts. I was looking for a large T-shirt because somebody has worn out their T-shirt, and we might be able to provide. I'm almost out of large T-shirts, so I was there. But somebody came along and started to chat, and that sort of talking is very helpful too. I go to the Big Dig or the Depression Pond on 2nd Street. It's rather a wonderful, wonderful site. And the designers of that site, where they took out a lot of houses and made a big pond so that if you have a 5-inch rainfall, it gets impounded on 2nd Street and doesn't mean that you have to row a boat down Green Street and have it in your basement. So there's purpose to this thing, but it also has trails, and it has people with bicycles, with walking, with dogs on a leash, and we have geese. And the geese sometimes get to be 100 at a time. And I think the Park District probably has some way of controlling the geese. They probably change their eggs for concrete eggs. And so each couple can have up to 8 young ones, and they're exceptional grazers. They love lawns, and if they also love to be together. So you have a lot of geese at once, and they're not afraid of you if you walk by. They probably have brains enough to be able to recognize you from someone else that might come and exterminate them, and sometimes they do. So Urbana just got rid of 75 of these geese because they poop all over the place, and that's too bad. I'm looking at the clock to see how much time. Okay. One of the things that happens is that you meet people, and if you raise your hand with your mask on and say hi, you get to meet the owner of the dog, and the dog may be upset with you because the dog is not used to masks, and also the dog might be the sort of dog that wants to interact with you and see what you're going to do about the dog and be in charge. So just that interaction is tremendously helpful. You find out what people do for jobs. You find people that want to tell you that this is a rather wonderful site. It has pathways that are designed by somebody that knew what they were doing. There are huge apartment buildings looking over the pond, and the geese tend to keep to one pond that's deeper. And there I watched the other day a little strip of exposed mud when the rainfall comes down, it's kept, and then it eventually gets pumped out into the boneyard and goes down to the Danville and Wabash and Ohio and out to Mississippi. But there are people who have planted rain gardens and knew what they were doing. So the range of wetland and prairie species are there. There are horticulturists that know that you can put in a circle of all bee balm, and it can be wonderful. You can put in golden Alexander and penstemon and yellow coneflower, and it's wonderful to walk through. You get people giving you speeches about how wonderful this is. So we need to tell our city founders that this has worked, but it's worked in more than just the functional use of trying to control water. So you can volunteer, and you can volunteer in several ways. One of the ways is you do a small job. We unfortunately don't have a lot of small jobs. We need some people who have a commitment. It's like some people will deliver food to hospitalized people, but in this case, we need people who deliver concepts. If I look at the Depression Pond, I look at the long concrete wall where you can look over the pond. But wouldn't it be wonderful to put a sculpted piece there? And I saw one the other day. It was a dog. It's mainly brought in to discourage the geese, but it could be a wolf, or it could be a deer, and we have some of those things. The pond is a little too wet for some species, so you have to know which species where. So we look for volunteers that will have that sort of commitment. If you at the University Avenue end, we have a horticultural pond. It's sitting right on top of the boneyard, which comes through under University. So it's a completely artificial horticultural pond, but it's very nice. But last year, there were cardinal plants with a nice red flower, but cardinal plants need a lot of water. And this year, I don't see them yet. And I think it's because that pond is dependent on taking water off the surrounding roads that sort of float into it. And they're not awfully high, and there's not a lot of water in the middle of a drought. So you have to pick your species. The iris, on the other hand, in that pond are surviving because there's water enough for them, and they have survival mechanisms. There's drop seed at the moment. It's out. It's a very fine grass, and it has elegant seeds, and it does very well. The purple coneflower does well, and occasionally there's a liatris. And so I encourage you to take a walk around that area. And spreading a little further, we might say that this week on Friday coming up, we will probably be at Rantoul, and there we're looking to bulldoze some kind of ugly stuff that has been gathered over the centuries, probably the last few years, probably when there was an airport base, and it has an old road that goes through it. And once again, we have to know who owns what, and whether we might think of buying an adjacent 5-6 acres to increase the size of a remnant prairie that's coming back in as regrowth succession on what was a gravel pit, also known as I've forgotten the name at the moment, a borrow pit. A borrow pit. So the plants that are growing there are coming from basically remnant prairie across the road, and they're growing slowly with deep roots and into a glacial till with some luss, which is aeolian material blowing across from the meltways that dried up when the glaciers moved north and the climate warmed. So there's enough food there for primary plants, and gradually as you accumulate little segments of organic matter, you get the more sophisticated plants coming in. So at the moment, especially around the edges, you have dock and compass plant and yellow coneflower and rosinweed and a wonderful array of plants. And we'll be looking at seed at this time of the year, and especially seed of some of the asters that are a little bit more rare. And we're just hoping that people will get to see it. But they are not going to go 18 miles to see a rough little prairie that's 9 acres and it looks like weeds. So if you don't know exactly what you're looking at, it's too bad. So if we want to have your support as volunteers or financial supporters, then we have to create visual material that will go to you by the internet. And we do that mostly in virus time. It's been very hard to do that, but it also means that if we want to have guests that talk about the snakes or the mammals or the birds or the bees, then it's not so easy for us. We're holed up in an office. I have a little backdrop of Rantoul behind me, and we usually put pictures into those programs, but YouTube has its limitations. It is when you have a lot of people, you don't always get the visuals. You get the sound because that doesn't take up so much electronic space. But so we're encouraged to do blogs and special programs that we send to special people whom we know already have an interest, but they need to be reminded that this is a rather wonderful place, and there's 10 miles of similar territory all the way from Rantoul to Paxton. And what does Paxton think about this? And we need you to be going to that webinar that is in September and October, and learning a little bit about being more than a functionary doing a job. You need to be thinking about what this is going to be like in 100 years' time. How does this relate to another trail or to another organization who might be interested? It's a tremendous task, and we hope that some of you will do it. Some of you have friends and relatives that might belong to this sort of thing, not in a private sense, but in a public sense. And people are there, and I'm going to quit with enough time for Gina to put in some advertising. I do want to thank WEFT for giving us the opportunity to talk to this sort of program, to Banner Public Television for allowing us to have a Zoom camera and a microphone that allows us to talk to you now on a radio. Our program right now is going to Urbana and then going to back to WEF for the sound for broadcast tomorrow at 11 o'clock. But then Jason Liggett has to send that program to us, so we can drop in pictures, and it's rough and tough. We're multitasking. We're using a video program that goes up twice a week on Channel 6 for public television, but it also, radio is kind of different from video, and radio involves your imagination. Video gives you a picture that saves you saying 1,000 words. So we're glad to have a camera and a Zoom, and it might not be everything, but it really is helpful. So this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And think about your environment.